I spent 11 years listening to a channel nobody else on the station believed was worth staffing. Outpost Halden sat on a rock too small to have a real name. One relay dish and a backup dish and a coffee maker that had outlived 3 station commanders. My job was to catalog the noise. Most of it was noise. Old freight beacons still pinging their last known coordinates a century after the freighters were scrapped. Automated weather buoys arguing with each other in a dead protocol nobody had bothered to update. And under all of it, so faint the software flagged it as instrument drift. A slow, patient chatter that had been running since before I got here. I called it the drone. Everyone who worked the graveyard shift called it that. It came in on a frequency band that predated the current communications treaty by 2 generations. Structured, packetized, always the same cadence. A status ping, a diagnostic string, a silence, and then it did it again 4 hours later. I ran it through every classifier we had. Weather telemetry, said one. Reactor housekeeping data, said another. Junk, said the third. And junk was the consensus, because nobody wanted to spend a requisition cycle chasing a signal that had been doing exactly the same thing since before any of us were born. The dish itself was the oldest piece of equipment on the station. A parabolic reflector pitted with 2 decades of dust storms. Its motor housing patched twice by hand, because the manufacturer had stopped making the part before I was born. I used to run my palm along the base plate on cold shifts, feeling the vibration of the tracking servo doing its slow, useless sweep across a patch of sky nobody thought mattered. It was easy, on those shifts, to feel like the last person awake in a very large, very quiet house. Then one shift, the cadence changed. It wasn't dramatic. That was the thing about it. Nothing about that colony's systems ever screamed. The diagnostic string got longer, the silence between pings got shorter, and buried in the packet structure, something the classifiers had never bothered to parse because it wasn't formatted like a distress call, was a field the software finally flagged as a match. Atmospheric processor unit, thermal regulation failure, cascading. I woke my shift lead. She woke the duty officer. By the time anyone with authority to act was looking at my screen, the packet had repeated itself 6 times, each one a little more desperate in its numbers, and exactly as calm in its language, because whatever had written that protocol had never been told to sound afraid. We traced the origin to a colony 3 light months out, a place called Ashmere Reach, built 2 centuries back by a consortium that had since dissolved into 3 smaller polities, none of which, as far as our archive showed, had any standing arrangement with Earth. Nobody there had hailed us. Nobody there, as it turned out, knew we existed. What we found, once the analysts pulled the packet's manufacturer header, was that Ashmere Reach's atmospheric processors had been built under an old industrial license, Earth origin hardware, sold off decades before any treaty existed, back when a defunct terraforming combine had exported half its catalog to anyone with the currency for it. Buried in every unit's firmware was a maintenance registry field, a single line that had never been updated because nobody who bought the hardware had ever thought to. Primary technical contact, Earth Systems Directorate, Station Halden Relay. The consortium that built Ashmere Reach hadn't reached out to us. Their processors had, quietly, dutifully, on a schedule nobody at the colony had authorized or even remembered existed, because the machines were only doing what they'd always done, reporting home to the address stamped into them at the factory, and home had never stopped listening. I want to be clear about what we did next, because it wasn't what people expect when they hear distress call. We didn't spin up a relief convoy. Nobody drafted an intervention order. The duty officer looked at the packet, looked at the manufacturer header, and said the 2 words I'd hear repeated by everyone up the chain for the rest of that week. That's maintenance. And she was right. The processors weren't asking for rescue. They were asking, in the only language they'd ever been given, for a firmware patch and a recalibration string that the original manufacturer had stopped issuing before the colony's grandparents were born. So that's what we sent. 9 hours of engineers pulling archived schematics out of a storage vault nobody had opened since the terraforming combine folded, compiling a patch, running it against every failure mode in the packet's diagnostic history, and transmitting it back down the same channel the processors had been broadcasting from for 2 centuries. No ship left dock. No one suited up. We sent code, addressed to a machine, because that was what the machine had actually asked for. It landed at Ashmere Reach 11 hours later, and that's where the man who eventually contacted us, an intelligence officer named Threll Austin, whose job before that week had apparently been auditing supply manifests, not diplomacy, picked up the story from the other end. He told it to me himself, months later, over a connection neither of our governments had officially sanctioned, because by then, a working line existed whether the paperwork had caught up or not. He said the first anyone at Ashmere Reach knew of the failing processors was when half the colony's western dome lost thermal regulation and started venting heat faster than the reserve units could compensate. He said the engineers who scrambled to the control room found the array already stabilizing, temperatures leveling off in real time, a diagnostic overlay running a patch sequence none of them had written, and none of them had authorization to run. He said it took his team 4 days to trace the patch back to its source, because the processors hadn't logged where it came from. They'd simply installed it, the way they'd install any properly signed update, because as far as the hardware was concerned, the signature on that patch was the same signature it had trusted since the day it was manufactured. Those 4 days, he said, were the strangest of his career. His team pulled every maintenance contractor on record, cross-referenced every consortium that had ever held a service agreement with the Western Dome, and found nothing. No invoice, no request, no authorization chain that led anywhere except a manufacturer that had folded generations before any of them were commissioned. For a while, he told me, the working theory in his office was sabotage, because a fix nobody asked for felt, to people trained to look for threats, exactly like an intrusion. It took a junior technician, cross-referencing hardware serials against an obsolete parts catalog, to find the one thread that actually held, a contact field, still sitting in the firmware, pointing at an address none of them had ever queried because none of them had known it existed. 4 days. 4 days of a room full of engineers and one increasingly quiet intelligence officer staring at a firmware log that said, in effect, that their colony's dying atmosphere had been saved by an update authorized by a directorate that had gone defunct on paper before their consortium had ever bought the hardware. An update sent, they eventually confirmed, from a relay station 3 light months away, on a world whose name none of them could find in any registry that mattered to them. Threll Austin asked me, on that first real conversation, the question that I think mattered more to him than the atmosphere ever had. He asked how we knew to answer, not why, how, as if the scale of the thing troubled him less than the mechanism. I told him the truth, because there wasn't a better answer available. We didn't decide to answer. Nobody voted on it, nobody weighed the diplomatic cost, nobody drafted a doctrine for it. A machine reported a fault to an address it had been given 2 centuries ago, and another machine, on our end, was still listening at that address, because nobody had ever told it to stop. He was quiet for a long time after that. I've thought about that silence more than almost anything else from that week. Not grief, not gratitude, nothing that clean. Just a man doing the arithmetic on how long a promise can keep itself running after everyone who made it is gone, and not quite landing on a number he liked. We never sent a ship to Ashmere Reach. There was never a fleet inbound, no armada idling in orbit, no ceremony, nothing that would have made a story out of it if either side had wanted one. What we sent was 200 kilobytes of code, addressed correctly, to a device that had never stopped believing someone would pick up. The processors are still running out there. Threll Austin updated the manufacturer registry field himself the week after, so the next time something failed, it would route to his own engineers instead of across 3 light months to a relay station on a rock without a name. I like to think he did it carefully. I like to think he understood exactly what he was closing off. I still work the graveyard shift. The drone is quieter now, routine, exactly what it should have been all along. Some nights I still listen to it longer than I need to, because for 2 centuries, it was the only voice on that channel that never stopped asking, and I was the first person in a long time who happened to be awake when it finally got an answer.